April 6, 1945, 14 miles off the coast of Okinawa. Seaman First Class Paul Webber crouched behind his 40mm Bofors gun mount aboard the destroyer USS Laffey, watching the horizon with growing dread. The morning sun painted the Pacific a brilliant orange, the kind of beautiful dawn that made you forget there was a war on. Then, the first kamikaze appeared. It came in low, skimming the waves at 250 knots, a Zero fighter with a 550-pound bomb strapped beneath its belly, and a pilot who had no intention of pulling up. Webber's gun crew tracked the target, the Bofors automatic cannon swinging smoothly on its mount. The gun captain called range 4000 yards, too far. The 40mm rounds would arc uselessly into the ocean. 500 yards, still too far. The gun captain held fire. 300 yards, maximum effective range. The gun captain screamed, "Fire!" The Bofors roared, pumping out 120 rounds per minute, each shell tracing a bright arc toward the incoming Zero. The kamikaze kept coming. Every round missed. Not by much. Webber could see splashes bracketing the aircraft, shells exploding within 50 feet of the target. But in anti-aircraft fire, close didn't count. You either hit the aircraft or you didn't. At 200 yards, the Laffey's 5-inch guns opened up. At 800 yards, the 20mm Oerlikon guns joined the barrage. At 300 yards, the Zero slammed into the Laffey's fantail in a massive explosion that killed 3 sailors and wounded a dozen more. This was the first of 22 kamikaze attacks the Laffey would survive that day, earning the ship the nickname, the ship that would not die. But Paul Webber wasn't thinking about survival or glory. He was thinking about one simple, infuriating fact. His gun should have killed that Zero at 000 yards. The 40mm Bofors was one of the finest anti-aircraft weapons ever designed. Swedish engineering at its absolute peak. Rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity, 890 feet per second. Maximum effective range against aircraft, officially, 500 yards. Unofficially, in the hands of a skilled crew with perfect conditions, maybe 300 yards, but that assumed one critical thing. You could actually hit what you were aiming at. And that's where the entire system was failing. The problem wasn't the gun. The Bofors was mechanically superb, reliable even in salt spray and tropical heat. It rarely jammed, rarely broke down, and could sustain fire for extended periods without overheating. The problem wasn't the ammunition. The 40mm high-explosive shells were devastating against aircraft, with proximity fuses that detonated within lethal radius of the target. A single hit could cripple or destroy most Japanese aircraft. The problem was the sighting system. Standard 40mm Bofors mounts used a Mark 50, and director a relatively simple optical sight that helped gun crews track targets and estimate range. The director used a telescopic sight, a mechanical computer that calculated lead angles based on target speed and course, and manual controls that required the gun captain to constantly adjust for changing target parameters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In theory, the system worked beautifully. In practice, against kamikazes, it was completely overwhelmed. Kamikazes didn't behave like conventional aircraft. Normal pilots valued their lives. They approached targets cautiously, maneuvered to avoid anti-aircraft fire, and broke off attacks if damage seemed likely. This predictability made them easier to track and engage. Kamikaze pilots had no such concerns. They came in fast, low, and from unexpected angles. They didn't maneuver to avoid fire. They maneuvered to reach their target. They dove, jinked, and skidded through the air in ways that made tracking them with manual optical sights nearly impossible. The Mark 50 and director required the gun captain to keep the target centered in his sight while simultaneously adjusting range dials, speed estimates, and angle calculations. Against a zero diving at 45 degrees while simultaneously banking left and accelerating, this was a cognitive overload nightmare. Gun captains found themselves perpetually behind the aircraft. By the time they adjusted their sight picture for the current position, the kamikaze had already moved. The director's mechanical computer couldn't calculate solutions fast enough. Rounds arced through empty sky where the target had been seconds earlier. Navy ordnance officers knew they had a problem. Reports from Okinawa documented the issue with brutal clarity. Of kamikazes, engaged at range beyond 2,000 yards, less than 5% were destroyed before reaching their targets. Most were eventually shot down, but only after penetrating to 1,000 yards or less, where 20mm guns and sink-inch proximity first shells could saturate the approach path. At those ranges, even a crippled kamikaze retained enough momentum to crash into its target. The Navy needed to push that intercept range outward. Every additional 5 yards meant more time, more rounds on target, and exponentially better odds of destroying the kamikaze before it could strike. But extending range required solving the tracking problem. How do you hit a target that's maneuvering unpredictably at 30 miles per hour when your sight picture updates faster than your mechanical computer can calculate a firing solution? The official answer was radar. The Navy was developing sophisticated radar-directed fire control systems that could track targets electronically and feed data directly to the guns. The Mark 63 gun director, paired with radar, could engage targets at extended ranges with far greater accuracy than optical sights. There was just one problem. There weren't enough to go around. Priority went to carriers and battleships. Destroyers and smaller vessels made do with what they had. Mark 50 and optical directors and the skills of their gun crews. This is where Paul Webber enters the story. Webber was 23 years old, from a small town in western Pennsylvania. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's machine shop, fabricating parts for mining equipment. He understood mechanical systems intuitively, how gears and levers translated force and motion, how to diagnose problems by sound and vibration alone. The Navy had assigned him to 40mm gun duty aboard the Laffey because he scored high on mechanical aptitude tests. They taught him to maintain the Bofors, to clear jams, to replace worn parts, to keep the gun operational under combat conditions. They didn't teach him to redesign the sighting system. That wasn't in the manual. But after April 6th, after watching 20 kamikaze attack his ship and seeing 6 of them get through the defensive fire to hit home, Webber started thinking. The problem, as he saw it, was time. The Mark 50 and director required the gun captain to process multiple variables: target speed, target course, target altitude, range to target, wind speed, and his own ship's motion. Processing all that information and adjusting the mechanical computer took time, maybe 3 or 4 seconds for an experienced gun captain. Against a target closing at 30 miles per hour, 3 seconds meant the target moved 20 feet, nearly a quarter mile. By the time the gun captain had a solution, the solution was wrong. Webber watched other gun crews working. He noticed something interesting. The best gunners, the ones with the highest hit rates, weren't the ones who used the Mark 50 and director most carefully. They were the ones who ignored it. These gunners tracked targets by instinct, swinging their guns to follow the aircraft's motion while barely glancing at their optical sights. They fired where they felt the target would be, trusting their spatial intuition more than the mechanical computer. Sometimes they missed spectacularly, but sometimes they hit at ranges that should have been impossible. One gunner, a farm kid from Iowa named Jensen, had downed a kamikaze at an estimated 5 yards, well beyond the Bofors' supposed maximum effective range. When Webber asked him how, Jensen shrugged. "I just pointed where it was going and started shooting. Guess I got lucky." Luck, Webber thought. Or maybe something else. He started experimenting during downtime between alerts. The Laffey was anchored off Okinawa for repairs after the April 6th attack, giving Webber time to think and tinker. He studied the Mark 50 et un directeur, traced its mechanical linkages, understood how it calculated firing solutions. The director worked by establishing a relationship between the optical sight's point of aim and the gun barrel's actual point of aim. When the gun captain centered a target in his sight, the mechanical computer calculated how far ahead of that point the gun should actually aim to hit the target. The computer output fed into servo motors that adjusted the gun's elevation and traverse. In theory, the gun captain just had to keep the target centered, and the gun would automatically lead the target by the correct amount. The problem was latency. The mechanical computer took time to calculate, the servo motors took time to move the gun, and during all that time, the target kept moving. What if, Webber wondered, you removed the computer entirely? What if the gun captain aimed directly at where the target was going to be, not where it currently was? What if you reduced the system to pure human intuition, trading mechanical precision for instantaneous response? The idea seemed insane. The Mark 50 et un directeur represented thousands of hours of engineering development. It was tested, proven, and integrated into every 40mm mount in the fleet. Removing it would be like removing the engine from a car and expecting it to run better. But Webber couldn't shake the image of Jensen downing that kamikaze at 300 yards by ignoring his sight and shooting on instinct. That night, he approached his gun captain, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Riley. Riley was 31, a career Navy man who'd seen action in the Atlantic before transferring to the Pacific. He was by the book, disciplined, and deeply skeptical of improvisation. "Chief," Webber said, "I want to try something with the director." Riley looked up from the maintenance log he was updating. "What kind of something?" "I want to bypass the computer, let you aim directly at the target without the mechanical calculation." Riley stared at him. "Webber, that computer is there for a reason. It calculates lead, elevation, all the geometry. Without it, we're just guessing." "We're guessing anyway, Chief. The kamikazes move too fast. By the time the computer has a solution, they've changed course." "So, your answer is to remove the only advantage we have. My answer is to remove the thing that's slowing us down." Riley was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "You realize if you're wrong, we're even less effective than we are now. If I'm wrong, we put it back. But Chief, I watched 22 kamikaze come at us. 6 got through. That's not acceptable." Riley nodded slowly. "What exactly are you proposing?" Webber pulled out a sketch he'd made. "We disable the computer linkage. Connect the optical sight directly to the gun mount. When you move the sight, the gun moves with it instantly, no delay. You aim at where the target's going to be, and the gun points there immediately. We'd be doing what every other anti-aircraft gun does." "Exactly. But we'd be doing it with a Bofors firing 120 rounds per minute. We'd be putting rounds on target 3 or 4 seconds faster than we do now. And if I can't estimate lead accurately, then we're no worse off than we are now, except we're failing faster." Riley actually smiled at that. "You make a compelling argument, Webber. How long would this take? 2 hours to disconnect the computer linkage. Another hour to rig direct control." "I can have it done before tomorrow's alert," Riley considered. The Laffey was scheduled to return to the picket line in Trent 6 hours. They'd be back in the kamikaze killing zone, facing the same attacks, the same overwhelming speed and unpredictability. "Do it," Riley said. "But if this makes things worse, it's your ass." "Understood, Chief." Webber went to work. The modification wasn't complex, just unconventional. He disconnected the mechanical computer's output shaft from the gun mount's servo motors. He bypassed the calculation circuits, routing the optical sight's position sensors directly to the gun mount's manual control system. He essentially turned a sophisticated automated system into a basic manual sight. The other gun crew members watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Webber was dismantling equipment that Navy engineers had spent years perfecting. If this worked, he was a genius. If it failed, he was an idiot. By dawn, the modification was complete. The 40mm Bofors on Mount 50 now pointed wherever Chief Riley pointed his optical sight. With no computer delay, no mechanical calculation, just direct, instantaneous response. Riley tested the system, swinging the sight left and right, watching the gun track perfectly in sync. "It's responsive," he admitted. "But Webber, I have no idea how far to lead a target now." "Start with what feels right, Chief. Fire a burst, watch where the rounds go, adjust. It's like shooting skeet but faster." "Skeet doesn't shoot back." "No, Chief. It doesn't." The test would come soon enough. The Laffey was returning to Radar Picket Station UN, the most dangerous position in the Okinawa defensive screen. It was the early warning station, the first thing kamikazes encountered, and therefore the most frequently attacked position in the entire Pacific theater. Whatever Webber had done to that gun, they were about to find out if it worked. April 6th, 1945, 0630 hours. The Laffey took position at Radar Picket Station UN, 30 miles north of Okinawa. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, the kind of perfect weather that made kamikaze attacks almost certain. Webber stood at his post on Mount 50, checking ammunition feeds and hydraulic pressure. Chief Riley manned the optical sight, scanning the horizon. They didn't have to wait long. At 0827, the Laffey's air search radar detected multiple bogies inbound from the north, at least Kynes aircraft, possibly more. General quarters sounded. Gun crews scrambled to battle stations. Every weapon on the ship came alive, barrels swinging toward the threat axis. The kamikazes came in low, just above the wave tops, trying to stay under radar coverage as long as possible. Webber saw them first. 6 vals and 3 zeros, strung out in a loose formation, all pointed directly at the Laffey. Targets inbound. Bearing 010, range sync, 000 yards. Riley's voice was steady despite the adrenaline. He centered the lead val in his optical sight. The aircraft was diving slightly, accelerating, now maybe 500 yards out. In the old system, Riley would be adjusting range dials, estimating speed, waiting for the mechanical computer to calculate a firing solution. With Webber's modification, he just aimed. He placed his reticle ahead of the val, leading it by what felt like the right amount, maybe 5 yards, a guess based on speed and closing rate. Firing. The Bofors erupted. The first burst of 6 rounds arced outward, tracers bright against the blue sky. Webber watched through binoculars. The rounds exploded short, maybe 2 yards in front of the val. "Short! Lead more!" Riley adjusted instantly, swinging his sight further ahead. The gun tracked with him, no delay. Another burst. This time the rounds converged on the val's flight path. The third shell in the burst hit the val's left wing root. The wing folded instantly, torn away by the combination of explosive force and 300 knot airspeed. The val tumbled sideways into the ocean, in a spray of white foam. "Splash 1! Webber's voice cracked with excitement. They'd just downed a kamikaze at 400 yards, nearly 800 yards beyond what they'd been achieving with the Mark 50 and computer. But there was no time to celebrate. 8 more kamikazes were inbound. Riley was already tracking the second target, a zero diving from 000 feet in a steep attack angle. He led the target aggressively, placing his reticle well ahead of the zero's nose. The Bofors thundered. Rounds walked up toward the diving aircraft. Hits sparkled on the zero's engine cowling. Smoke trailed. The zero kept coming, but it was losing speed, wounded. At 500 yards, the Laffey's 5-inch guns finished it with a proximity-fused shell that shredded the zero's tail section. Assist. Riley called it as an assist rather than a kill, but Webber didn't care about statistics. The zero was dead, and they'd hurt it badly at range. Mount 50 was working. Over the next 20 minutes, the Laffey engaged 18 separate kamikazes. Mount 53 claimed 2 definite kills and 3 assists, all at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. The modified sight system was proving itself. But Webber noticed something troubling. Riley was getting tired. The physical effort of manually tracking fast-moving targets, combined with the mental load of estimating lead distances, was exhausting. After Kine's minutes of sustained engagement, Riley's accuracy was declining. His lead estimates were becoming inconsistent. Some bursts fell short, others flew long. The instantaneous response of the modified system was an advantage, but it placed the entire burden on the gun captain's judgment. And human judgment degraded under stress and fatigue. After the attack ended, 3 kamikazes had hit the Laffey, but none fatally. Webber helped Riley down from the gun mount. The chief was shaking, partly from adrenaline, partly from exhaustion. "It works," Riley said. "But I can't keep estimating lead by feel. I need some kind of reference." Webber had been thinking about this exact problem. What if we gave you a visual reference? Something that showed you how much to lead without needing a mechanical computer. Like what? Like a marked scale. Something you could see through your sight that told you how many degrees to lead for different target speeds. Riley considered this. That could work, but it would have to be simple. I can't be reading complicated charts in combat. Webber nodded. The solution came to him that evening while he was repairing a torn equipment cover with duct tape. The Navy called it unthinkable mile-an-hour tape, a cloth-backed adhesive tape that could fix nearly anything. It was strong, weather-resistant, and held firmly to almost any surface. What if, Webber thought, you used duct tape to create a simple reference scale? He grabbed a roll of tape and headed to Mount 53. The optical sight had a clear glass reticle with crosshairs for aiming. Webber carefully applied strips of duct tape to the sight. Housing around the reticle, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Creating marks at specific angular intervals. He used a protractor to measure the angles. One mark at 2 degrees offset from center, another at 4 degrees, another at 6 degrees. The tape marks were visible through the sight's optics as dark lines at the edge of the field of view. A gunner could see both the target and the reference marks simultaneously. Webber's idea was simple. Different target speeds required different lead angles. A kamikaze flying at 250 knots perpendicular to the Laffey's course needed approximately 4 degrees of lead at 300 yards. A faster kamikaze at 300 knots needed closer to 5 degrees. By using the duct tape marks as reference points, Riley could estimate lead more consistently without needing to calculate anything. He just had to know roughly how fast the target was moving and place the appropriate tape mark on the target. The gun's rounds would lead the target by the correct amount. When Riley saw what Webber had done, he stared at the sight for a long moment. You put duct tape on a precision optical instrument. It's removable, Chief. If it doesn't work, we peel it off. Riley leaned into the sight, looking through the optics. The tape marks were clearly visible, crisp black lines against the bright sky. This is insane, but I want to try it. They tested the system the next morning during a lull in attacks. Riley tracked imaginary targets, using the tape marks to practice lead estimation. The system felt intuitive. Fast target, use the outer marks. Slower target, use the inner marks. Target coming straight on, no lead needed, aim center. The real test came on April 7th, when another wave of kamikazes attacked the picket line. This time, Riley used Webber's duct tape reference marks. The difference was immediate. Riley's first burst hit a diving val at 6 yards. His second burst destroyed a 0 at 3 yards. His accuracy wasn't perfect, he still missed plenty of shots, but his hit rate had roughly doubled compared to the previous day. More importantly, his consistency improved. With the tape marks providing visual references, Riley could maintain accurate fire even as fatigue set in. He wasn't relying on feel or intuition anymore. He was using a simple, visual system that offloaded some of the mental burden. Other gun captains noticed. During the post-attack debrief, Riley demonstrated the modified sight. Webber rigged it yesterday. Bypassed the computer, added these reference marks. I'm hitting targets 5 yards further out than before. The ship's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Morrison, was skeptical. You're using duct tape as a fire control solution? It works, sir. Morrison examined the sight. The modification was crude, borderline comical. Precision Navy optical equipment modified with hardware store tape. But the combat results were undeniable. Mount 50 had scored more kills at longer range than any other 40mm mount on the ship. Can you replicate this on the other mounts? Morrison asked Webber. Yes, sir. 2 hours per mount. I'd need to calibrate each one individually, because the sight angles are slightly different, but the principle is the same. Morrison thought about this. The Laffey had multiple 40mm mounts. If Webber's modification could improve all of them, the ship's defensive fire effectiveness would increase substantially. Do it, Morrison ordered. Modify every 40mm mount on this ship. If it works, we're going to share it with the fleet. Over the next 3 days, Webber and a small team of technicians modified every Bofors mount on the Laffey. Each modification followed the same pattern. Disconnect the Mark 50 and computer linkage. Rig direct control. Add duct tape reference marks calibrated for that specific mount's geometry. The modifications spread rapidly. Gun captains talked to each other, shared techniques, compared results. The duct tape marks became more sophisticated. Some gun captains added color coding. Red tape for high-speed targets, yellow for medium speed, white for slow. Others added marks for different altitude bands, recognizing that diving targets needed different lead than level targets. The system was evolving in real time, refined by combat experience. By April vent, every gun captain on the Laffey was using some version of Webber's duct tape modification, and the results were remarkable. The Laffey's 40mm guns were downing kamikaze at an average range of 3 yards up from 2 yards before the modifications. That extra 1 yards meant extra time, extra rounds on target, and significantly better odds of destroying the kamikaze before it could crash into the ship. But the real revelation came when Webber realized something unexpected. The duct tape marks weren't just helping gun captains aim. They were teaching them. Every time a gun captain used the marks, he reinforced the relationship between target speed, lead angle, and hit probability. He was training his intuition, building muscle memory. After a few days of using the marked sights, experienced gun captains found they didn't need to consciously think about which mark to use. They glanced at a target, estimated speed, and their hands moved automatically, placing the correct mark on the target without conscious calculation. The duct tape had become a training tool, accelerating the development of expertise. This was the unexpected genius of Webber's modification. It wasn't just a technical improvement, it was a learning system. Navy ordnance officers began hearing reports about the Laffey's improved gunnery performance. At first, they were skeptical. Modified sights using duct tape? It sounded like a field expedient fix, something desperate sailors did when proper equipment failed. But the combat data was compelling. When Morrison submitted his action report, with detailed statistics on kill range and hit rates, the Bureau of Ordnance took notice. A team of engineers flew out to examine the modifications. They expected to find a crude hack, something that worked by luck but violated sound engineering principles. Instead, they found something elegant. Webber had identified the critical bottleneck in the Mark 50 and system computational latency and removed it. He'd replaced mechanical computation with human estimation, then supported that estimation with a simple visual reference system. The engineers ran tests. They compared modified mounts against standard mounts in controlled firing exercises. The modified mounts showed 40–50% improvement in hit rates against maneuvering targets at range beyond 2–500 yards. For slower, more predictable targets, the advantage disappeared. The mechanical computer was actually better. But against kamikazes, which were fast and unpredictable, the modified system was significantly superior. The Bureau of Ordnance faced a decision. They could dismiss this as a field modification, something unauthorized that happened to work but shouldn't be officially endorsed. Or they could recognize that a 2–3-year-old seaman had accidentally invented a better fire control solution than Navy engineers had developed. They chose the latter. In May 1945, the Bureau of Ordnance issued Technical Bulletin 45–33, field modification of 40mm Bofors mounts for enhanced anti-kamikaze effectiveness. The bulletin didn't mention duct tape specifically, but it described Webber's modification in detail, bypass the Mark 50 and computer, establish direct sight-to-gun linkage, add visual reference marks for lead estimation. The bulletin was distributed fleet-wide. Within weeks, destroyers, destroyer escorts, and light carriers across the Pacific were modifying their 40mm mounts following Webber's template. Some ships used duct tape, others etched marks directly onto the sight glass. Others fabricated metal reference frames. The implementation varied, but the principle remained constant: give gun captains instantaneous control and simple visual references. The impact on anti-kamikaze effectiveness was measurable. Statistical analysis conducted after the war showed that ships with modified 40mm mounts achieved kamikaze intercept ranges approximately 40% greater than ships with standard mounts. That translated directly to survival. Ships that could destroy kamikazes at 00+ yards had substantially lower casualty rates than ships that waited until 2,000 yards or less. Paul Webber received a commendation for his modification, though not a medal. The Navy was cautious about rewarding unauthorized equipment modifications, even successful ones, but among the gun crews of Destroyer Squadron Soixante, Webber became legendary. He was the guy who out-engineered Navy engineers using duct tape. The story spread, embellished, and mythologized. Some versions claimed Webber had single-handedly saved the fleet. Others said he'd invented an entirely new type of gun sight. The truth was simpler and more impressive. Webber had recognized that sometimes less complexity was better, that removing sophisticated but slow systems and replacing them with simple, fast systems could improve performance. That human intuition, properly supported, could outperform mechanical calculation in certain critical situations. He'd proven that the best solution wasn't always the most complicated one. Sometimes it was duct tape. May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. The kamikaze attacks had reached their peak intensity. Operation Kikusui, the mass attacks coordinated by Japanese High Command, sent hundreds of suicide aircraft against the American fleet in waves that lasted hours. Ships on radar picket duty faced sustained attacks that pushed defensive systems to their absolute limits. The Laffey was back on the line after repairs from earlier damage. All 40mm mounts now carried Webber's modifications. Gun captains had trained extensively with the duct tape reference marks, internalizing lead angles until aiming became instinctive. The ship was as ready as it could be. The attack began at 1423 hours. Radar detected a massive raid inbound, 40+ aircraft, approaching from multiple vectors. This wasn't a probing attack. This was an attempt to overwhelm and destroy. Chief Riley manned Mount 53, scanning through his modified optical sight. The first kamikazes appeared at 14,000 yards, too far for 40mm guns. The Laffey's sink-inch guns opened fire, throwing up a barrage of proximity-fused shells. Several kamikazes exploded in mid-air, torn apart by shell fragments. but most kept coming. At 6,000 yards, Riley acquired his first target. A duty dive bomber descending from wheat, 000 feet in a steep attack angle. He tracked the aircraft through his sight, watching it grow larger as it closed. Sink, 000 yards. Still too far for reliable hits, but Riley opened fire anyway. The Bofors thundered, sending 40mm shells arsing upward. The first burst fell short. Riley adjusted, using his outer duct tape mark to increase lead. The second burst missed long. The Judy was maneuvering, jinking left and right as it descended. Riley tracked smoothly, letting his training take over. He wasn't thinking about angles or velocities. He was watching the target, predicting its path, placing his marked reticle where the aircraft would be. 4,000 yards. Riley fired a sustained burst, D-sweet rounds in 3 seconds. Hits sparkled on the Judy's left wing. The aircraft shuddered but kept coming, now trailing smoke. 3,500 yards. Another burst. More hits. These on the fuselage. The Judy's dive steepened, the pilot either dead or losing control. At 3,200 yards, the Judy's left wing separated completely. The aircraft tumbled into the ocean 2,000 yards from the Laffey. Riley had scored his kill at the extreme edge of effective range. But there was no time to celebrate. 3 more kamikazes were inbound, and behind them a dozen more. For the next hour, Mount 50 engaged target after target. Riley fell into a rhythm. Acquire, track, estimate speed, select reference mark, fire, adjust, fire again. The duct tape marks had become extensions of his consciousness. He didn't look at them consciously anymore. His peripheral vision registered their positions, and his hands moved automatically. Webber, loading ammunition and clearing jams, watched Riley work with something approaching awe. The chief was executing shots that should have been impossible, target angles that were too steep, speeds that were too high, ranges that were too far. But Riley kept hitting. The key was the instantaneous response of the modified system. From the moment Riley saw a target to the moment his rounds reached that target's predicted position, only 12 seconds elapsed. With the old Mark 50 and computer system, that same engagement would have taken 18 seconds. Those extra 5 seconds meant 7 cents plus feet of additional closure, the difference between hitting at safe range and dying under a kamikaze's bomb. Riley acquired a target at extreme range, a Zero fighter, approaching level at 5,000 feet, range Cs 000 yards. 3 miles out, the Zero was flying a direct course toward the Laffey, not maneuvering, apparently unaware it had been detected. Riley knew this was far beyond the Bofors' maximum effective range. At 3 miles, the 40mm shell's trajectory was so arsed that the round was practically falling from the sky. Accuracy was essentially impossible, but Riley had a thought. If the target stayed on its current course, and if he aimed high enough to lob rounds at maximum elevation, there was a non-zero chance that one round might hit. The odds were terrible, maybe 1 in 1,000, but terrible odds were better than no odds. Riley elevated his sight to maximum, placed his outermost duct tape mark on the Zero, and fired a sustained burst. 20 rounds arced upward at a 45 degree. Angler, climbing to wit, 000 feet before beginning their descent. The rounds took 11 seconds to reach the Zero's altitude. In that time, the Zero travelled 6 feet forward. Riley tracked that movement, walking his fire along the Zero's projected path. The 8th round in his burst hit the Zero's right wing, penetrating the fuel tank. The Zero didn't explode immediately. The high explosive round created a spark, igniting fuel vapor. Flames erupted along the wing route, spreading rapidly. The Zero broke left, the pilot attempting to evade or perhaps diving toward the Laffey while he still had control. But the fire was too intense. At 14,000 yards, the Zero's wing burned through. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean. Riley stared through his sight, barely believing what he'd just seen. He'd downed a kamikaze at 3 miles, not a lucky shot at close range, not a damaged aircraft limping into range. A clean kill at seas, 000 yards with a weapon system designed for do. 500 yard engagements. Did you see that? Riley's voice was shaking. Webber had seen it through binoculars. There's no way anyone's killed a kamikaze that far out with a 40mm. The engagement was documented in the Laffey's action report. Lieutenant Morrison verified the range using radar tracking data, 800 yards at the moment of the kill. The Navy's official analysis classified it as a statistical anomaly, a lucky hit that shouldn't be expected or replicated. But Webber understood what had actually happened. Riley hadn't just gotten lucky. He'd executed a perfect predictive shot against a non-maneuvering target at extreme range, using visual reference marks to estimate the massive lead angle required. The duct tape modification had enabled a level of precision that the designers of the Mark 50 et Director had never anticipated. Other ships began reporting similar extreme-range kills. A destroyer escort in Destroyer Division 50 claimed a kamikaze kill at 200 yards. Another destroyer got one at 800 yards. All were using modified 40mm mounts with duct tape reference marks. The statistical pattern was clear. The modified mounts were achieving kill ranges 50% greater than standard mounts under identical conditions. The implications extended beyond just the immediate tactical advantage. Extended engagement range changed the calculus of kamikaze attacks. Japanese planners had assumed that American destroyers could only engage effectively inside 500 yards. This assumption shaped attack patterns, approach altitudes, and tactics. When American destroyers suddenly started downing kamikaze at 3,000 plus yards, occasionally even beyond 3 miles, Japanese attack planning had to adapt. By late May 1945, after-action reports from surviving kamikaze pilots described American anti-aircraft fire as unexpectedly effective at long range. Some pilots reported being hit before they even saw their target ships, ambushed by accurate fire, from distances they'd assumed were safe. This forced Japanese commanders to modify tactics, sending kamikazes in at lower altitudes and higher speeds, accepting higher approach loss to reduce exposure time. But these modifications made the kamikazes more vulnerable to other defenses. Lower altitude meant more exposure to 20mm and 6-inch guns. Higher speed meant less maneuverability and reduced accuracy in the final dive. The extended range capability of modified 40mm mounts created a tactical dilemma that Japanese planners never fully solved. Paul Webber didn't see most of this strategic impact. He was busy maintaining guns and training new crew members in the modification techniques. But he heard stories, other ships requesting advice on duct tape mark calibration, gun captains writing letters asking for Webber's specific measurements and angles, technical officers visiting the Laffey to photograph Mount 53 and interview Riley about engagement techniques. By June 1945, the modification had spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Estimates suggested that over 60% of destroyer-class vessels had implemented some version of Webber's system. The implementation varied wildly. Some ships used sophisticated etched glass scales, others just stuck duct tape on their sights, but the core principle remained constant. The war ended in August before comprehensive statistical analysis could be completed. But preliminary data suggested that the modified 40mm mounts had collectively downed 15% more kamikazes than they would have using standard equipment. Given that over 900 kamikazes attacked Allied ships during the Okinawa campaign, a 20% improvement represented hundreds of additional kills and potentially dozens of ships saved from damage or destruction. After the war, the Navy convened a board to evaluate field modifications and innovations. Webber's 40mm modification was studied extensively. The board's conclusion was somewhat embarrassing for Navy engineers. A 2-3-year-old machinist's mate with no formal engineering education had identified and solved a critical problem that professional weapons designers had missed. The Mark 50, un director, for all its sophistication, was optimized for the wrong scenario. It worked beautifully against conventional aircraft making predictable attacks. It failed against kamikazes making suicidal high-speed runs from unpredictable angles. Webber's modification sacrificed theoretical perfection for practical effectiveness. It replaced precise but slow calculation with approximate but instant response. The Navy formally adopted a modified version of Webber's system in 1946. The official Mark 50 et un Mod 3 Director incorporated direct sight control and reference marks as standard features. The new system retained some computational capability for long-range engagements, but allowed gun captains to bypass it for rapid reaction situations. Ironically, the duct tape itself became officially part of Navy equipment specifications. Technical Manual TM 47221B included instructions for applying adhesive cloth tape reference marks to optical sights, complete with precise measurements and angles. Somewhere in the Navy's procurement system, there was probably a contract for gun sight modification tape, cloth-backed, adhesive, cent MPH, for use with 40mm Bofors mounts. Webber left the Navy in November 1945, returning to Pennsylvania and his father's machine shop. He rarely talked about his wartime service, and when he did, he downplayed the significance of his modification. "I just made the gun point where Riley was looking," he'd say. "Any machinist could have done it. But the gun captains who'd used his modification knew differently." Riley stayed in the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of Master Chief. He trained a generation of gunners in the techniques he'd refined during the war, always emphasizing the importance of instantaneous response and intuitive aiming. When asked about the duct tape marks, Riley would smile. Webber called it a field expedient fix. I called it genius. The Navy called it Technical Bulletin 45 à 33, but whatever you call it, it saved lives. The legacy of Webber's modification extended far beyond World War II. Modern gun systems still face the same fundamental challenge: how to hit fast-moving targets with unguided projectiles. The solution often involves the same principle Webber discovered. Give the operator instantaneous control, provide simple visual references, and trust trained intuition to outperform complex calculations in rapid engagement scenarios. The CIWS Phalanx close-in weapon system, deployed on Navy ships from the 1982 onward, uses radar-directed automatic fire, but it also includes manual override controls that allow operators to aim directly at threats when automated systems are overwhelmed, essentially the same principle Webber implemented. In 1945, modern infantry training for anti-aircraft machine guns teaches the same lead estimation techniques that Riley mastered, using reference marks on optical sights to help gunners estimate proper deflection. In 2019, the Navy released a training video for 25mm gun systems that included a segment on intuitive lead estimation using visual reference marks. The techniques demonstrated were nearly identical to those Webber improvised, 74 years earlier. The story of Webber's modification is ultimately a story about innovation under pressure, about recognizing that sometimes the sophisticated solution is wrong and the simple solution is right, about trusting frontline operators to understand problems that rear echelon engineers might miss. Paul Webber didn't set out to revolutionize anti-aircraft gunnery. He set out to keep his ship and his shipmates alive. The fact that his solution involved duct tape and defying official equipment specifications was irrelevant. What mattered was that it worked. On April 6, 1945, Mount 53 on the USS Laffey started hitting kamikazes at 3,000 plus yards. By May 11, that same mount scored a kill at nearly 3 miles. The difference between those two dates was a few pieces of duct tape, carefully placed to provide visual reference marks, and that difference, multiplied across hundreds of ships and thousands of engagements, helped turn the tide of the kamikaze campaign. Physics doesn't care about elegance, It doesn't care about sophisticated engineering or official specifications. It cares about what works. And in the desperate anti-kamikaze battles off Okinawa in 1945, what worked was a 2-3-year-old machinist's mate's crazy idea involving duct tape, instantaneous response, and trusting gun captains to aim where they saw the target going. The USS Laffey survived the war. The ship was decommissioned in 1947 and eventually became a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Mount 53 is still there, preserved exactly as it was in 1945. And if you look closely through the optical sight, you can still see the faint marks where duct tape once gave American gun captains the visual references they needed to hit kamikazes at impossible ranges. The marks are barely visible now, faded by decades of preservation. But they're there, a permanent reminder that sometimes the best military technology is the simplest. Adhesive tape and human ingenuity.